Everybody knows the tulip story. In 1637, the Dutch went collectively insane over flowers. A single bulb sold for the price of a house. Ordinary people mortgaged everything to buy them. Then the price collapsed overnight. Fortunes vanished. The Dutch economy was wrecked, and ruined men threw themselves into the canals. It's the founding story of every conversation about financial madness ever since. The prices were real. The collapse was real. Almost everything after that is not. And most of the version you know comes from one book written by a journalist 200 years later, working from satirical pamphlets. That book also gave us the phrase we still use for all of this, the madness of crowds. Which is exactly the wrong way to look at any of the four things in this video. So, start with why a flower was worth anything at all. Tulips arrived in Europe from the Ottoman world in the 16th century, and in the Dutch Republic they became a luxury good, a way for newly wealthy merchants to display taste. The most valuable ones had dramatic streaks and flames of color on the petals. And those patterns could not be produced reliably because they were caused by a virus. You could not plan a striped tulip. You had to get one and then propagate it slowly, a few bulbs at a time. So the rarest varieties were genuinely scarce, genuinely beautiful, and genuinely impossible to mass produce. Expensive is not irrational. Through 1636, the prices for the rare bulbs climbed steeply, and in February 1637 they collapsed. Now the corrections, which come from historians going through the actual archives, court records, inventories, contracts. First, the number of people involved was small, not a nation. A limited circle of merchants and skilled craftsmen, concentrated in a handful of towns, many of whom already knew each other. Second, and this is the big one, most of the trading was in contracts, not flowers. Bulbs are in the ground for most of the year. You cannot hand one over in December. So people were buying and selling promises, agreements to deliver a bulb at a price when the season came, which means that when the price collapsed, most of those agreements had never been settled. No money had changed hands yet. What followed was not mass ruin. It was a mess of disputes about whether the contracts still counted, and it was largely resolved by annulling them or settling at a small percentage of the agreed price. The researcher who went through those records found no bankruptcies caused by tulips alone, and no suicides. The Dutch economy carried on being the most successful in Europe. So where does the version everyone knows come from? Partly from pamphlets written at the time, satirical dialogues mocking the traders, which were moral commentary rather than reporting and were meant to be funny. And mostly from a book published in 1841 by a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay, called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. It is entertaining. It has never been out of print, and its tulip chapter takes the satires at face value. Nearly every retelling since traces back to it, including the sailor who supposedly ate a priceless bulb thinking it was an onion, which is a pamphlet joke that has been repeated as fact for 180 years. The South Sea Company was founded in Britain in 1711, and it is usually described as a trading company whose shares got out of hand. It was not really a trading company. Its actual purpose was debt. Britain had spent enormous sums on war and owed money it was struggling to service. The arrangement was that the company would take on chunks of that government debt, and in exchange it received a monopoly on trade with Spanish South America. There was one problem with the monopoly, which was that Spain controlled the ports and had no intention of opening them. Actual trade was tiny, a handful of voyages, mostly in enslaved people under restrictive terms. So the company's value did not come from trade. It came from the debt arrangement, and from what people believed about the trade. In 1720, the company proposed a much larger version of the same deal, converting a huge slice of the national debt into its shares. For that to work, the share price had to be high, and to keep it high the company needed enthusiasm, so it manufactured it. Shares were made available to members of parliament and government figures on terms that meant they could profit without ever putting money down, which gave a great many influential people a direct interest in the price going up. It rose roughly tenfold in a matter of months, and then in the autumn it collapsed. Isaac Newton lost a large sum in it, which is the detail everybody remembers, and it's usually told as proof that even a genius can be swept up in a mania. But look at what he was actually being swept up in. Not a delusion about flowers. A scheme underwritten by the government, endorsed by Parliament, and promoted by people who had been given shares to promote it. And then there's what happened afterwards, which is the sharpest thing in this act. Parliament passed the Bubble Act, restricting the formation of new joint stock companies. It is often described as a response to the crash, protecting the public from the next one. It was passed months before the collapse, and its effect was to make it harder for rival ventures to compete for investors' money, which is precisely what the South Sea Company wanted. The great regulatory response to the bubble was, in large part, written for the bubble's benefit. Both of those were prices doing something strange while the money itself stayed exactly what it was. A guilder was still a guilder. A pound was still a pound. The next two are not about prices, the next two are about the money. What it is, who decides it's worth anything, and what happens on the day people stop agreeing. In one of them, that took 4 years, in the other, about 18 months. John Law was Scottish, and before any of this he killed a man in a duel in London, was convicted, and escaped from prison. He spent years on the continent making a living as a professional gambler, which he was extremely good at, because he understood probability better than the people he was playing against. He also had a theory. He believed that a country's prosperity was limited by how much money was circulating in it, and that a nation using only gold and silver coin was strangling itself, because you can only have as much money as you have metal. His solution was paper. Notes issued by a bank, backed by something, and accepted as money. In 1716, France was in serious financial trouble after decades of war, and was willing to try things. Law got permission to set up a bank issuing notes. It worked. Notes circulated, credit expanded, trade picked up. Then he merged it with a company holding the trade monopoly for French Louisiana, which at that point meant an enormous territory in North America that almost no French person had seen. And this is where it turns. The company issued shares. People could buy them with the bank's paper notes. The bank could print more notes, which people used to buy more shares, which pushed the price up, which made the notes look well-backed, which justified printing more. Each part propped up the other, and Law was running both. By 1720, he was Controller General of Finances, a foreign-born convicted killer directing the economy of the most powerful kingdom in Europe. The promotional material for Louisiana described a land of gold mines and easy fortune. The reality was swamp, disease, and a colony that could not absorb the settlers being shipped there, some of them forcibly. When enough people tried to convert paper back into coin, there wasn't nearly enough coin. Law tried to hold it together by decree, restricting how much gold a person could own, then devaluing the shares by order. That destroyed the last of the confidence. He fled France and died poor in Venice, and the effect outlasted him by generations. France came out of it so distrustful of paper money and of banks that its financial system stayed underdeveloped for a very long time, which mattered enormously when the state ran into money trouble again later that century. The last one is the one everybody can picture, and it isn't a bubble at all. Nothing was being speculated on. The money simply stopped working. Germany had financed the First World War largely by borrowing rather than taxing, on the assumption of winning and making someone else pay. That did not happen, and the peace terms added very large reparation obligations on top. In January 1923, with payments in arrears, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to take the payments in goods directly. The German response was passive resistance. The workers in the region stopped working, which meant the government now had to support an entire industrial population that was producing nothing while its main source of production was occupied, and while it still owed money abroad, it paid them with newly printed notes. And once that starts, it accelerates on its own because everybody adjusts. Workers demand daily wages, then twice daily. Shops reprice hourly. Nobody holds the currency for a second longer than they must, which makes it fall faster, which makes everyone hold it even less. By late 1923, the numbers stopped meaning anything. Notes were printed with denominations in the trillions. The photographs are real. Banknotes used as wallpaper, as kindling, given to children to play with because they were cheaper than blocks. People on fixed incomes and savings lost effectively everything. People with debts saw them evaporate. It rearranged who owned what across an entire society in about 18 months. And then it stopped, almost immediately. In November 1923, a new currency was introduced, strictly limited in quantity and presented as backed by the country's land and industry. That backing was largely symbolic. What mattered was that the quantity was capped and the government committed to it. Within weeks, prices stabilized. Within months, it was over. The thing everybody remembers as an uncontrollable catastrophe was ended by a decision, and the decision worked as soon as enough people believed it would. All 4 of these get filed under the same heading. People went mad about money. Now look at what was actually underneath each one. The tulip trade was a small circle of people buying forward contracts on a genuinely scarce luxury, and the disaster in it was mostly written afterwards by someone selling a book about human folly. The South Sea Company was a government debt scheme with a trading monopoly attached that it could not use, promoted by politicians who had been given shares. The Mississippi scheme was one man running a bank and a company simultaneously, where each one's value depended on the other. And Germany in 1923 was a state with an occupied industrial region, paying a striking workforce with printed notes because there was no other option available to it. Not one of those is a crowd going mad. All four are a structure: a contract, a monopoly, a printing press, an act of parliament, behaving exactly as it was set up to behave. And the madness of crowds is a very comfortable explanation, which is why it has never been out of print since 1841. If everyone went mad, then nobody wrote the rules, nobody benefited, and there's nothing to examine afterwards. It's much easier to say a nation lost its mind over flowers than to read the contracts. If you want more of these, the strange, hard, mostly forgotten corners of history, subscribing is how you get them. It genuinely helps, and it's free. And if you want more of this, the things almost everybody believes about history, and the specific people who made them up, that one's on the screen now.